Hello, my name is
Okay.
Maria Andrea Bernal Cruz. I am an LLM student at Penn State Dickinson Law. I am currently in the Manglona Lab for Gender and Economic Equity. For the lab's Witness to History project, we're capturing the personal experiences of women during a dynamic era in the United States. Today, I have the privilege of welcoming Denise Sticha to join me. She's a lifelong librarian, mother, and professional. Hi, Denise. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Good morning.
Well, let's get started. So let's
Okay.
start at the very beginning. When were you born?
I was born in 1955,
Where were you born?
Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
And growing up, where lived in your home with you?
I lived in Pittsburgh the whole time I was growing up. I had an older sister who was about 18 months older than I was, and that was my only sibling.
Okay. And did you live with your parents at
I
home?
did, yes.
Both of them.
Yes, my mother and my father.
Did both of your parents work outside the home?
They did actually, and back in those days, it was a little unusual that my mother was fully employed. Although I don't believe she started to work until I was like maybe in third or fourth grade. But then she worked full time the whole rest of the time I was living at home and for the rest of her life.
Okay. And what did she do for work?
She had a very varied career because she had not gone to college. Neither of my parents went to college. My mother got her first job that I can remember as the school secretary at my elementary school. And then she went on to um, work in a different elementary school as like a teacher's aide. And then eventually she ended up in bookkeeping. And the rest of her career, she worked as a bookkeeper for a variety of different companies.
Okay. And did she ever retire or she continued to work all her life?
She continued to work all of her life and she retired, I believe, when she was like 62 or 63. She just actually passed away a year ago and she was 94 at the time.
Oh, wow. I'm very sorry to hear about
It
that.
was actually like just 2 days ago was the first anniversary of her passing. So
Oh,
um,
I'm very sorry to hear that. But she sounds like an amazing woman.
she was, she was.
And your dad, what did your dad do for work?
My father was an electrician. Um, he was actually in my family. My younger son is now also an electrician, and my younger son is the fifth generation um, inter, IBEW, International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. My father was an electrician. My grandfather was an electrician. My great uncle, my father's uncle was an electrician, and his father was a founding member of the Pittsburgh local of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. So
Oh, wow.
we have a long history of being in electricity, I guess. So he worked the entire time as well. He passed away in 2019, and he was 89 when he passed away. My parents celebrated 62 years together. They actually met in high school.
Oh, in high school.
Yeah.
And did they tell you a little bit about their story of
Oh
how they
yeah, it
met?
was like, yes, everybody knew the whole thing. Yes, they met in the nurse's office when my mother was there and was taking out a splinter of my father. That's how they met. My mother actually wanted to be a nurse, but at that time, which would have been like in the like late 40s, early 50s, it was not that common for women to get advanced degrees, and her father didn't want her. Her father was not supportive of her going on to college, so she did not, and she always kind of felt bad about that. She did actually, when she was an older woman, like maybe in her 40s and 50s, she did go back to college. She went to college and took several classes, but she never graduated. She never had enough credits to graduate.
Okay. And you told me she kind of regretted that.
She
What did she?
did. Yeah, education was a big thing for both of my parents because neither one of them had gone to college. So both my sister and I were encouraged very early on that we were going to go to college. And my father and my mother both particularly were of the mind that a woman should be able to support themselves, regardless of whether they were married or not. So
Oh,
that was sort of a foundation to both my sister and I.
and was that a common thing among your community and among your family that you guys were gonna be educated and you're gonna get college degrees, or
I
was
think
that?
so. I think both my mother's siblings and my father's siblings, their kids mostly went on for degrees. It really wasn't something that we talked a lot about growing up. It was just sort of this expectation. And I think because my mom worked the whole time I was like growing up too, there was not this sense that that was a weird thing for a woman to do. It was just kind of like, that's what we do. But I do know that my mother was a little unusual, that most of my friends' moms growing up were not working outside of the home.
Oh, and did that sparkle any curiosity in you on the why, maybe?
No, I don't really think so. I mean, you have to think that this was around the time of the 70s. And so the whole women's liberation thing was like this big thing. Um, so no, it was just kind of like, if that's what you want to do, that's what you do. But the expectation in our family growing up was that um, women should be able to support themselves, and if we wanted to choose to be a stay-at-home parent, we could, but the idea was that we weren't going to be dependent on that kind of marital arrangement. I don't know why my parents felt so strongly about that, but they did.
That's good. And going back to your family life when you were younger, how were responsibilities divided in your home?
I would say domestic chores were pretty much gender-based, and my mother took care of the things inside the house. My father took care of the things outside the house. My sister and I had chores to do. We made dinner every night because my mom didn't get home until, we got home from school a lot earlier than my mom did. So we did dinner. We had chores that we had to do. So I don't think that was really something that we thought a whole lot about. I mean, we saw my dad actually be involved in doing things too. I mean, he certainly was, um, I mean, I remember he showed up at school events and all of those kinds of things. But as far as domestic labor, I don't think my dad could boil water. Um, I just really don't think he could. Um, so so there was that. I do know that when my mom retired and my dad retired, um, my mom got kind of cranky about being the person who always had to like make dinner, and my dad did the dishes. After they retired, my dad did the dishes, my mom cooked, but it became much more problematic when they were in their 80s because my mom just really flat out decided she didn't want to cook anymore. And that was a hard that they that was hard for them, how to age with those kinds of gender issues.
Yeah, and how did you guys handle that? Or
Well, eventually my parents moved into a continuum of care community. So they were both like in their early 80s when they did that. And so that worked out fairly well for a number of years, until my father started to have balance issues, and he really shouldn't have been driving. And they were very independent people, so they didn't like to ask for help, and they weren't comfortable accepting help. So even though they had a plan in place to take care of them as they aged, they really were uncomfortable with accepting help. So what ended up happening is my sister and I had to move them out of their independent living cottage into assisted living. And both my parents really, really resented that. Those were kind of hard years. But the reality was that my father lost something like 30 pounds in about 2 months because he wasn't driving them to go eat and go to the grocery store, and my mom wasn't cooking. So I think they were eating, cereal And they could have had meals delivered to their house. They could have, I mean, there were all sorts of things in place that could have helped them, manage that, but they were too proud to do that for whatever reason.
Yeah, that's tough. Aging is not easy.
No, no.
Yeah. Well, circling back a couple of
Okay.
years
Okay.
earlier, with your sister, were ex did you guys have different? Did your parents have different expectations for the two of you, or the same?
I think they were about the same. My sister, um, when she graduated from high school, she went to college in Boston, so that was a distance from Pittsburgh. And basically, she made her life in New England. She is a pharmacist, and so she also worked the entire time that she's retired now. She's a year older than I am, so she's 71. So she retired a couple years ago, but she's still working part-time at the same hospital that she worked in just because. So I would say that there really wasn't that expectation of differing expectations for my sister and I.
Okay, that's good. Um, and by any chance, did you get to meet your grandmothers?
Yes, I knew all four of my grandparents, my mother's parents and my father's parents, and had probably a fairly close relationship with all of them. I mean, we saw them on holidays. We all lived with about 20 minutes to a half an hour traffic from them. So we did see a lot of them. My grandmother on my mother's side was very much what you would call a traditional housewife. And when my mother's father passed away, I was in college at that time. I remember sitting with my mom at my grandmother's kitchen table, showing her how to write a check
Oh, wow.
because she had never done that. She had no idea. She didn't drive. She didn't know any of that. Now, on my father's side, that was also still a pretty traditional arrangement, but I think my father's mother was a little bit more, um, how do I want to put this? She wasn't as accommodating maybe as my mother's mother was, and so um, I don't know. She passed away before my grandfather did, so we didn't have to worry about that.
Oh, okay. And what did your grandmothers think? Maybe if you had conversations with them about all of these changes that were going on in the 60s, in the 70s regarding gender equity.
I don't remember my father's parents talking a lot about that. Um, they seem to be people that like they did things together and they were up and about and traveled and all of that. Whereas my mother's father worked for the telephone company, and when he retired, he basically sat in his chair and drank himself to death. Um, that sounds kind of a cruel way to do that, but he was not a very communicative person. I have some memories of him, but not many. But I loved my grandmother, and she was like just the nicest, sweetest woman that you could ever imagine. And she was all about making other people feel comfortable, and that's really what she did. So I don't really remember having conversations with her about, all of the changes that were going on, but she was certainly always interested in what we were learning in school. And, I would have conversations with her about that.
Could you give an example of a conversation that you had with her?
Well, let me try and think. She was a reader. She read a lot, and I read a lot. And so that was one of the things that we talked about. She was also very religious, and she was raised Catholic, and the Catholic faith was very, very important to her. And I do remember going to church with her a lot. We were raised Lutheran, so church was very important to us growing up as well. Um, but we didn't really talk a lot about what we believed. It was just kind of like, here's the body of what we're supposed to believe, and we didn't really talk about that. But I do think that my grandmother's faith was important to her. And I think more so than any kind of gender lines. It was all about just being a good person, and doing what you needed to do to make your family feel comfortable and be healthy and thrive.
That's very interesting. Um, do you remember when you were little? What do you want to be when you grew up?
Well, here we go to what we kind of talked a little bit about in our introduction. So, I was a reader a lot during my childhood. I was actually somewhat ill a lot. I had a lot of ear infections growing up. So I missed a lot of school and I stayed home a lot. And so reading was something that was really important to me. And when my mom got her first job as the school secretary at the elementary school, she had to be at the school before school started, obviously. And so my sister and I would go with her in the morning. Um, and I needed something to do. My sister would like do homework or something, and I was not I didn't have a lot of homework for whatever reason. So I got to work in the school library in the morning before school opened with the school librarian. And it started out, I just got to put the books away or dust a little bit or something. And then by the time I was in sixth grade, I was reading stories to the little kindergartners. And so, then I graduated in sixth grade and went to junior high and started to work in the library in junior high. And then I worked in the library in high school. And then I worked in the library in college. So there really wasn't any point in time that I could think of that I wanted to do something different. And I had wonderful role models through all of that. And so it just seemed to me that that was where I was supposed to be and what I was supposed to do.
That's awesome.
It's very
Um,
unusual. I didn't think about it at the time, but I know people struggle a lot with what am I going to be when I grow up? And sometimes they're like 40 and they're still trying to figure that out. And I never had that. I never
you
had
always
that.
knew.
I always knew. There
And
was
do you
never a
remember?
doubt.
And do you remember what book, if there was, what books were you reading when you were little, when you say you started going to the school library?
I read voraciously. So and we always seem to have books at home. We went to the library, our community library as well. So I can't really remember a lot. I think back then I liked historical fiction. I liked biography. I can remember reading those. But it just really I think what I really enjoyed was the variety of things that were in the library. And it's like, oh, I'm interested in horses. So I'm gonna like check out a whole stack of books about horses and go home and read them. And it was that kind of thing. It just seemed like whatever I was interested in, I could find something in the library to read and learn more about it. I do remember, since I was kind of sickly a lot growing up, we had a set of encyclopedias that were called the Book of Knowledge. It wasn't like the World Book, it was the Book of Knowledge, and they weren't arranged alphabetically. It was more of a thematic kind of arrangement. And I can remember reading through the entire encyclopedia set at some point. That probably sounded more involved than it was, but they were just like sitting on shelves and it was just something. So I was used to like having a thought and then going and reading more about my thought.
That's very interesting. So you love to, I'm getting that you love to learn.
Yes, yes, and I think my parents' expectations that this was something that was important. This learning aspect was always encouraged. In fact, I'll share just this one story about my mom because it's kind of an interesting story too. But when I was in junior high and I was working in the library, there was a bookcase that had locked glass doors on the front, and you had to be in ninth grade in order to read the books from that cabinet. And I was like in seventh grade or eighth grade or something. And I was putting books back into the cabinet because I was shelving. That was my job. And there was something that I wanted to read, and it was Bullfinch's Mythology, which doesn't strike you as a really controversial book, but there it was in the locked case. And I just like went home one night and like was mentioning it to my mom. Like I didn't really think it was a big deal, but my mom got really upset about that. And she wrote a letter to the principal and the school board, and I was able to read anything in that case that I wanted to read. Um, so, that I think kind of speaks to my parents' value that they placed on learning. Um, so
Yeah, that you deserve to learn.
yeah, yeah.
No.
And I can remember, my mom at the time, I think Peyton Place was a big book growing up, and it was kind of, it probably would have been banned now. I don't think people read it, and it's probably kind of more tame now than seemed tame now than it was back then. But, my mom knew I was reading it, and I remember her saying, "Do you want to talk about this?" And I was like super embarrassed and said, "Oh, no." But she didn't not let me, she didn't say I couldn't read it. Um, so
That's great. I guess we'll discuss more about books when we get to, well, all throughout your
okay.
life, I guess the theme's gonna be books and reading.
Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna move on now to
Okay.
your schooling years in
Okay.
particular. So throughout elementary, middle, high school, did you have a dress code?
Yes. We were, um, I don't, I can't say whether this was a school dress code or whether it was my parents. My parents were fairly conservative. Um, So we were not allowed to wear pants to school. We had to wear dresses, and dresses had to be a certain length. Now, remember, we were growing up like in the 60s, so there was a lot of controversy about that. Um, but I don't really remember if the school had a dress code. It didn't seem to be something that impacted me one way or the other. But I do know that when I went to college, it was all like jeans and flannel shorts. So.
Oh, and how did that make you feel that you have to wear skirts always to school?
Everybody did, so I didn't think about it. I mean, we
Okay.
went to public school, so we didn't have uniforms. I did have a number of friends who went to the Catholic school and they did wear uniforms. But no, it didn't seem to be anything that we even really thought about.
Oh. And besides working at the library, did you join any other extracurricular activities?
Um, My sister and I were both Girl Scouts for a number of years. Um, and then we became Rainbow Girls. And Rainbow Girls was an organization for young girls that was, and the whole organization was affiliated with Masons, like the Masonic order. So my father was a Mason, my grandfather was a Mason, I guess a whole bunch of people on his side of the family were. My father's mother was a member of the Eastern Star, which is like Rainbow Girls for grown-up people. Um, and we had a lot of friends in that organization, so that was kind of a fun thing to do. I also babysat. Um, so when I was working in libraries, I wasn't getting paid for it. That was all kind of like a school thing. But I babysat a lot through high school, and that was kind of how I earned my spending money.
And regarding the Girl Scouts and Rainbow Girls, do you remember what activities did you guys do, and how
Um,
was the group composed?
well, Rainbow Girls was kind of it was kind of, now that I look back, kind of a weird thing. And actually, this is kind of interesting. We had a state conference up in Penn State every summer. And we had like this big um uh, tradition, kind of what word I'm looking for, like a ritual that was part of what Rainbow Girls was all about. And they did it in the old field house. So now every time I drive past the field, I was like, oh, I remember that. And we would come to Penn State for like this week and stay in a dorm. And of course, this was like the early 70s. And, there was just one sort of incense. I mean, for me, so my parents were fairly conservative. To have that experience of being like in Penn State for a week when I was in high school was pretty mind-blowing. Um, as far as other activities where we camped, Girl Scouts camped a lot. We went on camping vacations with my family. My my mother's sister and her husband, and they had two boys that were just a little bit older than my sister and I. We went on camping vacations every summer, usually to a Pennsylvania state park. Um, and that was really, I can't, I remember one big family vacation we took, and that was down to Williamsburg and the Outer Banks, and we did that one year. So we didn't take a lot of family vacations growing up, but we camped a lot. Um, and we went to church camp for a week every summer too. My parents were both counselors at our church camp off and on. So we did that as well. I was not a camper. I hated it. Um, I still don't really like it. I don't like sleeping in a sleeping bag. I don't like sleeping in the woods. Um, but that was what we did growing up. So
Well, you even though you didn't like it, sounds like you did it a lot.
we did, and it wasn't that bad. But it was not, I just really didn't, I was not the kind of person that really looked forward to getting out in the woods. It was like, oh, all right, I can do this for a week, kind of thing.
Yeah, I get that. Mm, in classes back in school, do you remember if there were classes just offered to men and ones just offered to women? For example, shop and home ec.
Okay, gym class definitely was men and women. In once we got into like junior high and high school, and we had to wear gym suits. We had to go in the off and put on these little white like gym suits. They had like buttons and it was like all one piece. Um, I don't know why, but we did that. Shop and home ec in junior high were both sexes. Boys and girls took shop and boys and girls took home ec. By the time we got to high school, they were electives, and I didn't elect to do either one of them, so I don't really remember whether they were gender specific. I don't remember that.
Oh, and regarding your gym class, um, was why were the classes different? Are you guys doing different exercises or
I don't know. We did the whole gamut from gymnastics to softball to swimming, and it was um, the boys and girls. And interesting, I do remember this because my maiden name is very long. My maiden name is Schindehedi. It's a German name. It's like 13 letters. And this was back in the day when computers were just, not even really there, but it seemed like on every printout, there would be the last name, which is Shindahedi, and then my first name, which is Denise, and it'd be DEN, and then it would get cut off. So I frequently ended up in boys' gym class because they thought it was Dennis for the first day. And it happened like every year. I was like, oh, all right. And then they would say, oh, and then I would just go into the girls' class. But I don't really know why we did that, but we were not, gym class was definitely segregated.
no? And were sports like sports teams offered for women? Like, could you join a
Oh,
soccer
yeah.
team or a,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. I was never particularly athletic, so I didn't do that. But yes, I remember in high school there was field hockey, there was softball. Gymnastics wasn't really big back then. I don't remember that. But I had friends that played field hockey. I had friends that played softball. Um, so
That's good. Mm, during your school experience, did you have any mentor, like any teacher that particularly resonated with you?
um, not particularly. The woman that was the fifth grade teacher when I was in fourth grade, um, she was a very close friend. She and my mom were close friends, and so she kind of followed my whole career. Um, so that was kind of nice. My sister, as a year older than I was, she was a very good student. She always had like straight A's, and I was not a bad student, but I was not that wasn't important to me. Getting straight A's wasn't really all that important. And I don't remember ever doing like a lot of homework except when you had like a paper or a project too. Whereas my sister, really did that. So, and my sister was kind of um, an an odd duck sort of person, and didn't have a lot of. She had we had a lot of friends together, and it was the kind of thing where most of the friends, I guess a good way that I like to think of my sister was the character in Winnie the Pooh, Eeyore.
Oh,
You know,
yeah.
that was kind of my sister. Everybody knew she was like that, and we just like, okay, that was her. Um, but it was sometimes challenging to grow up with her. She'd be the kind of sister that would tell on you to your parents for your own good. Um,
Oh,
yeah. And we're very close now, so we kind of outgrew that, but we had a lot of friends in common, and like I said, my parents were fairly conservative. We were not allowed to watch a lot of television. That was another theme kind of growing up. We were only allowed to watch like a couple hours on Friday night, a couple hours on Saturday night and Sunday night, but during the school week, we weren't allowed to watch television at all. Um, so I kind of grew up not having like the Saturday morning cartoon experience or anything like that. And I think that's another reason why we were such great readers, is because the TV wasn't on.
oh yeah, for sure. But for the hours that you could watch TV, do you remember what shows were you watching?
Yeah, we watched in the 70s, Saturday night was pretty big. There were a lot of good sitcoms on Saturday, but I remember watching Bonanza on Sunday night, Walt Disney World. We watched Gallant Men and Rawhide with my dad. Um, my dad was a big baseball watcher. And I remember we watched Wide World of Sports on Saturday afternoon. We would take the television out on the porch during the hot summer days and in the evenings and watch the baseball game on TV, sitting outside. Um, so, but I remember being in high school and like all of my friends were talking about Laugh-In and, some of these other shows um, that we just weren't allowed to watch. So that whole pop culture thing was not something that I really experienced directly because my parents kind of shut that off. Um, so
Yeah.
yeah.
And during high school, you kept working at the school library, right?
Yeah.
And during that time, that was you decided, okay, yeah, I'll go to college. I want to be a librarian. How,
Yep.
what was your plan? Do you wanted to stay near home or go out of state?
Well, my sister, because she was a year older than I was, went to Northeastern University up in Boston because they had a 5-year pharmacy program, and that's what she was going to be. And it was back then it was arranged where your freshman year you would go to school for the whole semester, then you would alternate semesters where you would work as an intern, and then the next semester you would go to school. So it took her 5 years to get a 4-year degree, but she worked at a Massachusetts General Hospital the whole time she was going to school there. Um, and then she met her husband up there. So she just kind of built her life up there. For me, my and that was, I think, really hard for everybody to have my sister be so far away. Um, I wanted to go to a small school. My high school graduating class was 1,300 people. So I wanted to go to a small school. And so my father drew like this map that was like about a 3-hour distance away, and we looked at different schools there. And I ended up picking, um, and it was my father who did the college visits with me for whatever reason. I don't know why he did that, but we went to look at 2 or 3 different colleges, and the decision to go to Bethany College was my decision. They didn't, that it was within the radius, so it was okay. Um, so that was how I ended up there. It was a much smaller school. It's in the middle of nowhere, West Virginia, in the Panhandle part of West Virginia. And my graduating college class was like 175 kids. So it
Oh,
was It was a really, really small, very intense. They had a lot of, you either like transferred out after your freshman year or you were like there for life. It was one of those kinds of things. And I felt it to be a very transformative experience for me. Um, Even though it was, this little tiny school in the middle of nowhere, I really felt comfortable there, and I worked in the library there the whole time.
And remind me, what year did you graduate high school?
I graduated from high school 73, and I graduated from college in 77.
Okay, and in college, your small class, what did your peers look like?
Um, it was not particularly diverse. Um, I would say maybe we had a handful of African American students there. We had probably, I knew a few Latino students or Hispanic students. I had someone who lived on my floor was a Filipino, but there was not a lot of diversity there. Mostly they were recruiting for whatever reason from like New Jersey and New York to like southwestern Pennsylvania and Ohio. And a lot of those people, they came for like their freshman year. I was like, wow, we got to get out of here. I mean, it didn't even have a gas station. That's how small the
Oh,
town was. It didn't even have a gas station. It had a church, a bar, and a post office and the school. So, and you had to drive to Wheeling, which was like a 40-minute windy road to get anywhere. They did have a bus that went on Saturdays, but that was about it. So it was a very, once you were there and you liked it there, it was a really close experience. Faculty, we were really close with faculty. I was an English major and was not one of the bigger majors. Um, I can say that probably most of my classes were about 8 students.
oh,
Yeah,
that's small.
yeah. Um, so it was one of those kinds of experiences where you couldn't escape anywhere. I mean, everybody kind of knew what everybody was doing, and we were all kind of okay with that.
And how did you like taking classes with such small groups?
Oh, I loved it. I loved it.
Oh, that's great. And your professors, that also gave you the chance to get close to your
Yep,
professors?
yeah. I babysat for the children of the library director. My year between my junior and senior year, I spent the entire summer at school. I didn't go home for vacation. I stayed at school and I worked in the library that whole summer. And back then they didn't offer a lot of summer programming, so there might have been like maybe I'm guessing like fewer than 50 students on campus during the summer. And everything was just really relaxed and it was just a really nice experience.
Very interesting, very different.
Yeah, I guess. But what we're not at that stage yet, but I can say that my two sons, my older son, I have 3 children, my older son and my younger son ended up going there as well.
And did
So
they like it?
they did. They did.
Mm.
So
And you told us you did have a job while you were studying. You babysat and you work at
I
the.
worked in the library. Yeah, the library was a work study job. I actually got paid. Um, I can one of my very first jobs there, and because I worked there for the whole 4 years, was when we would get newspapers, I would have to iron the crease out of the newspapers, and then we put them on these big rods. So you would like sit there and read the newspaper on a rod. That was kind of fun. By the time I was a senior, I was supervising freshman work study students. I was typing catalog cards because this was all before computers. So over the course of those 4 years, I really had an opportunity to see various aspects of what working in a library was like.
Yeah, for sure. And um, sorry. And while working at the library, did you work with other students? And how was the library director like?
The library director, Mr. Fry, Dr. Fry, he was great. The it was a very small staff, so there were like maybe the director and then like maybe three other librarians and then a bunch of work study students. Um, I don't really remember a whole lot about that, except the summer that I worked there, I got really close to the other ladies that worked there because I was there, 9 to 5 or whatever. Um, and I got to go to several different workshops over the summer with other library people. They would let me, I would go with one of the other staff people to do that. So when I was getting ready to apply to schools for my graduate degree, um, I ended up going to the University of Pittsburgh, and I did that because I could live at home and commute from home. I kind of wanted to go to Simmons up in Boston, but while my parents paid for my sister and I to go to college, except for the student loans that, well, even the student loans that we took out, my parents paid for that, but graduate school was going to be on me. If I wanted to go to graduate school, I had to pay for the whole thing. And so I had to live at home to do that. But it
Yeah.
was okay. And I felt getting my master's degree was really, I just needed that piece of paper. I found it to be incredibly boring because I had this whole body of experience beforehand, and it was just, so I didn't have real fond memories of grad school. It's just kind of something to get through. Plus, it was hard going back to living at home after not living at home for 4 years.
Yeah, for sure. And remind me, what was your master's on?
My master's was in library science.
Oh, and that makes all the difference between becoming a librarian and not, right?
Right, right. Yeah.
Okay, so going back to college for a little bit before we jump to graduate school. Um, you said it was a small school, but do you remember any if you did any extracurricular activities or like college
Mm,
activities?
I don't really remember that. I had a boyfriend and I lived with my boyfriend in the dorm room. Um, and that was not uncommon. There were other women that lived in the men's dorm too. And so we were just all really good friends, and it was kind of like a commune sort of thing. Drugs were pretty rampant back then. So, there was that sort of element. I did not play any sports. Um, I sang in the choir. I did sing in the choir my whole life. I was sang in church choir growing up. I sang in choir in college. So I did have that. Um, that was probably, I played piano for a number of years. I took piano my freshman year in college because I had taken it since I was like in ninth grade, maybe even before that. Um, I don't rem- I think I actually started piano lessons in like sixth grade. Um, but um, but I didn't belong to any organized groups or activities when I was in school. It's probably I just worked at the library and hung out with my friends and got my schoolwork done.
Yeah, and you mentioned dating. Can you tell us a little bit about how it was to date in the 70s? Did dating lead to marriage quickly or?
I don't think looking at college and the people that I'm still kind of aware of and who married who, um, I think there were. I mean, my freshman year, I dated a lot of other people. I mean, it would be like you would go to a fraternity party. I don't know if that would really be considered a date. I mean, you have to remember too that we lived in this school that you couldn't go anywhere. Um, Back then, hardly anybody had cars. When both my boys went there, people had cars, but when we went there, nobody had cars. So, you know, did we go on? I don't think we ever really called it going on dates because you would just like go with a group of friends to like see the movie that they were showing. So, but my boyfriend that I ended up living with, like, I don't really think we dated. I mean, it's just I don't even remember how it's just kind of, gradually like I ended up sleeping there. So that was that. And I I do know, now this is kind of interesting, in the room next to where my boyfriend and I lived was a man who was gay. And he was a really close friend of my boyfriend's. And he was in elementary education, which back then you really couldn't be gay and be in elementary education. That was like a big no thing. So he had like enormous issues, trying to figure out who he was and what he was going to do. And back then, that wasn't as acceptable as it was now. But because it was a small school, we all kind of like, there wasn't any animosity, I don't think. I think people just kind of accepted him for who he was. But it was still one of those kinds of things. And I had a huge crush on him, huge crush on him. But, you kind of knew that wasn't going to go anywhere. But he was a really close friend, and I'm still in touch with him now. He ended up not ever being an elementary school teacher, even though he would have been like a wonderful teacher. He ended up doing some sort of corporate insurance work in New York City. So, um, he probably would be really interesting to ask too. And I also, while I was in high school, I did have a boyfriend in high school too who had gone to our church. But I had another male friend who I've stayed close to my entire life. He just passed away last year from stage 4 cancer. And I had a huge crush on him too. I mean, he was like my first and only love, really. And in 2018, 2019, after he retired, he came out as gay and hadn't done it his entire life. I was like, well, that explains a lot. Um, so anyway, that was just kind of fun. But back to college, I think it was just the kind of thing where, because it was such a small school and we all kind of knew each other, you just formed like close little groups of friends, and they were really like your family.
And did you guys, because you were in college in the 70s, did you guys discuss or participate in any of the movements, social movements that were happening at the time?
I can, I know when I was in high school, my friend Dawn that I was just telling you about, the one who came out gay after like almost 60 years, um, we campaigned for McGovern. My father was a Democrat, my mother was Republican, but my father was really a Republican, but he had to be a Democrat. If you were in the Union, you had to be a Democrat. So they were pretty upset with the whole Nixon Watergate thing. And they were really upset that I was campaigning for McGovern. So that was kind of a big thing. I remember the hostage. I remember really liking Jimmy Carter. Um, we did not, Kent, I remember Kent State, and I think I was still in high school in Kent State. I mean, Vietnam was a big thing when I was growing up. Um, my one cousin, who's 7 years older than I was, he got drafted, and actually he ended up failing his physical because he was allergic to mosquitoes, so they couldn't send him to Vietnam for that. Um, so because we were a small school and we were like in the middle of nowhere, there weren't those kinds of publicity types of protests and things like that. I mean, if we wanted to like walk up and down the sidewalk with a sign, everybody would say, go for it, They weren't going to bring in the television cameras because they just weren't. So I think there was a lot of interest and following politics. I remember we discussed it a lot, but we weren't protesting because wasn't any place to do that. I mean, it seemed like everybody at the school kind of was on the same mindset anyway. So,
And what was your mindset, like the mindset of the youth at the time?
oh, we thought the Vietnam War should have been ended. We didn't think we should be there. Of course, when you're young, you're very idealistic too, and um, so it was mostly that kind of a protest, and um, it was just sort of the upper end of the civil rights movement, because that mostly happened a lot in the 60s. And of course, Bethany, being where it was not particularly diverse, although we were certainly open to diversity. It was just sort of like a geographic thing that it just didn't happen. Um, so I don't even think there was a lot of civil rights agitation when I was going to school because the people who were there that were not white, who were of different ethnic backgrounds, they were just accepted as everybody else because there were so few of us there.
But still, that's great, even if it's a small town, to have an
Yeah,
environment where everyone is accepted is it's
yeah.
amazing.
I guess it was. I didn't really think about it at the time. It was just kind of the way it was. Um, but yeah, all of the protests and things that happened on much larger campuses didn't happen with us.
And now during the 70s, other legislation was passed regarding gender equity. For example, we had Title IX that prohibited sex-based discrimination, the Equal Credit Opportunity that prohibited discrimination in credit decisions, and the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, which uh, prohibited discrimination for pregnant women, sorry. Do you recall if you discussed that with anybody, if you saw a change in the workplace?
Going to college, no, I don't think that was anything that we were really aware of. I do remember going to Planned Parenthood because that was like the only place you could get birth control. And that was obviously really important because we didn't want to have children at that point, and we were like sleeping with our boyfriends. So we would get on the bus and go to Wheeling however often you had to do that. Um, I did have a roommate who got pregnant and had an abortion, and that was kind of, that was freshman year. Um, and so that was kind of a big thing. I also had, and when I was high school, now that I mentioned it, one of my close friends in high school got knocked up, and she couldn't tell her parents. And so I went with her to have the procedure done, and we let her stay overnight. My mom knew about it, and we let her stay at home at our house while she kind of like recovered, which I thought was
Oh,
pretty amazing for my mom to like. But my mom was really big on women's liberation, and so when you're 17 years old and you have your whole life ahead of you and you find yourself pregnant, back then you were able to go to Planned Parenthood and do that. Um, but I
yeah,
don't,
and that story that you're telling me, it was before 1973, right? Right
yeah.
before Roe v. Wade.
Yeah, so let's see, if I graduated in 73, this was Mary Ellen Senior. It probably would have been either 72 or 73.
Okay.
Um, I think it would have been the spring of 73 because it was right before we graduated. Um, so, but I don't remember really following Roe versus Wade. I mean, I wasn't keyed into it in that regard.
Yeah.
Um,
And also it piqued my curiosity. You mentioned that your mother was very into the women liberation movement, but she was also fairly conservative. Do you?
Yes, that was sort of in that disconnect became much more apparent as she got older. Um, because while she was really, women should have these rights, and obviously they should, she also felt that it was really important for her to be like the domestic person, the person in charge of the household. It was very important for my mother was pretty what do I say? She maintained a really good house. I mean, she was very neat and tidy, and we dusted and cleaned, and back then you didn't eat out a lot, so she did a lot of cooking. And that was a source of pride for her that she was able to keep her house looking the way it did. Um,
Well, that's very interesting.
yeah, and then as she got older, I mean, she used to really yell at my dad because she had to do like all this ironing. And my dad was like, I'm not asking you to iron. You don't have to iron my, well, I'm not going to send you out of the house looking like that. It was that kind of thing. So it really kind of, my sister and I and my cousins would laugh a little bit about it because, yes, my mother was very adamant of being a feminist while we were all growing up, but she really didn't live her life that way.
Oh,
I mean, she
yeah.
she would want that for other people, but for her, that was not. but she always felt bad that because she worked the whole time, that my father would discredit a lot of her accomplishments, her financial contributions. But really, it was my mom that like helped pay for our college. Um, and so, you don't really know your parents' marriage. It's all that well, since you're just kind of like part of it. Um, but I do know that, she worked and she contributed to the financial success of their marriage. And sometimes she would just have to dig that to my dad. Like, um, and that was
Make a
important.
point to it.
Yeah, yeah. And it was important to her that she had her own money.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, your mother is a very
Oh,
interesting
she
person from
she
what I
she
hear.
is. She is.
Well,
Too bad she
circling
passed
back.
away.
Uh,
It's too
oh
because
yeah,
it would have been, now that she's gone, there are all these things that I wish I could have asked her while she was still alive. But you just didn't. I do
yeah.
remember one time asking my parents, this was like, while they were in their independent living cottage, because they were like in the 30s during the 60s and 70s. So they were fairly like young people. And the whole counterculture thing, I mean, that didn't, my father particularly was very racist, I would say now. Back then, it just seemed more normal. But yes, he was, I mean, he stopped watching the Steelers when they started to have more black football players. It was just kind of how he was. So the whole civil rights thing, while I was growing up, was sort of a hot button discussion issue. And I can't really say how my mom felt about that, but we were fairly non-diverse growing up. So we didn't have a lot of experience with that. But the whole counterculture, the music that was just coming out, my parents, that just didn't, you know, they didn't gravitate towards any of that. And I tried to talk to them about that when they were older, but they just didn't seem to have any awareness about that. Um, so,
And while you were growing up, you did have
oh
awareness
yeah,
of
yeah,
this.
yeah. I can actually remember being in high school and just like counting the days until I could go to college and kind of be on my own, which is why it was such a transformative experience. Um, and it was just kind of like I knew I had to just kind of like tough it out, and then eventually there would be like this release, and that's really kind of the way it was. um, and I have to say that to everybody's credit, we continued to get along and there were no like big divisions within the family or anything like that.
Yeah, circling back to college for a little bit. Um, did you what you told us that your plan after graduation was to get your master's, and that the choice was Pittsburgh, so you could live at home. Tell us a little bit more after graduation. How was your experience getting your graduate degree?
Well, it was kind of rocky because everybody was kind of used to not being living together. I When I came home in like June after graduation, um, I actually didn't work in a library then. I worked at an Eaton Park restaurant. Um, and then graduate school started in September. And my program was it was a full year, so it was like three semesters. Um, and it was kind of rocky living at home. I did finally, I think it was like, I don't know, like school started like late August, early September. I think like right before Christmas, right after Christmas, I did get a library job. So I was able to work part-time and give up the waitressing job. So that was kind of nice. My best friend, Dawn, the one who came out as gay like later, he graduated from Indiana University, and he was also living at home at the time. And so we hung out together. Um, and then, he ended up getting a job with AC Nielsen and moved to Youngstown, Ohio. And after my program was over, I got a job in Charleston, West Virginia. So that was kind of it was harder to stay in touch with high school friends after that. But my graduate year, I mean, basically I just kind of knew I had to get through the program, and it wasn't hard. It wasn't hard. I was working in a library at this time, so It was just one of those things. I had a car. Um, I didn't have to pay rent, so that was nice. My parents let me live rent free, so that was nice. But it's kind of weird because I was used to not, telling people where I was going. I was used to being a little bit more independent. My parents were used to not having me around. So it was a hard year, but we all made it through.
That's good. And do you remember the classes, the professors? If you what did your professors look like in graduate school? Also in college, I forgot to ask.
My professors were all, for the most part, white people. Um, at Bethany, in the English department, there were Professor Taylor. I went to Oxford for a semester my sophomore year. Bethany had a program where this professor, John Taylor, took a group of students there, and we like lived in housing. I mean, we weren't matriculated with Oxford University, but that was our base. So there was Professor Taylor, Dr. McGuffey, and Dr. Mitch. None of them were married. I think probably in hindsight, they were probably all gay. Um, but nobody really talked about that. Uh, but there was not a lot of diversity in my Bethany days. When I went to Pitt, again, I don't remember a lot of a diversity there either. So I graduated from my master's program in 78. Um, and, I do remember Tom Galvin was the dean, and he wrote the book that everybody used for our reference class. I mean, it was just kind of like I just had to pay this money to get this piece of paper. I mean, I know a lot of other people had these other more positive experiences. I didn't. Computers were just starting to come out, so my only technology class was like punch cards. Um, or and I don't even remember what it was that we had to do with that. I do remember that databases were all dial-up. They were coming out of like Lockheed, and so you had to, it was really expensive, and that's why libraries and librarians were important then, because we were trained on how to search. And so we could do a search in a much quicker time than somebody who didn't really know, about controlled vocabulary or anything like that. Um, I don't really remember a whole lot about technology during my 77, 78 grad school days, because it wasn't that big of a thing. Um, I think it was Dialogue. I think that was the name of the database, and it was a phone line. So you would like call in, and then you would have to search. I don't even remember now how it went. Um, but that was kind of, that was that. I didn't take any, I thought about going into the track where you would be a school librarian. And later, after I graduated and had kids and stuff, I really thought, well, I should have done that, because then I would have had my summers off and stuff. But at the time when I was at Bethany as an English major, you either went as an English major to become a teacher, and so you took education credits, or you just like graduated with a degree. Since I knew I was going to be a librarian, I didn't want to graduate. I didn't take the teacher track. So when I went to grad school, I was more following the public library track.
So you were telling me you wanted to go to public library after
I did.
your
I did.
master's. Um, After graduating with your master's in 1978, how did you get your first job in West Virginia that you were telling us about?
Well, so back then they would have like all these job postings on the bulletin boards. That's what people did back then. And there was one for Charleston, West Virginia, and the director of the Kanawha County Public Library in Charleston, West Virginia, was Nick Winowich, and his son, Nick Winowich Jr., went to Bethany and was in a relationship with one of my close friends. So of course I called Joy and I said, are you working there? And she was like a year older than I was. So anyway, I applied, and they invited me down for an interview. I flew down from Pittsburgh to Charleston, West Virginia on like this little puddle jumper airplane. That was kind of scary. But anyway, um, So I ended up there, and my friend Joy worked at one of the smaller branches. She did not have her master's degree. So she was working at one of the smaller branches, and her boyfriend Nick, I think he was doing like construction or something. But Nick Winowich Sr., the director of the library, hired me like that day. So I actually started work before I graduated. I mean, I was kind of like finished all my exams and everything, but it hadn't got my diploma. But I started right in like beginning of September of 78 down in Charleston, West Virginia at the main library.
And do you remember how was the interview process like?
Oh, it was really friendly. We talked a lot about Bethany because we all went there. They showed me around. I actually, when I moved into the apartment building that Joy and Nick lived in, um, I don't really remember a whole lot about the interview. It's just, I mean, I had this body of work experience that was very relevant. Plus, I had the educational experience. Um, so that was, it was the only job I applied for, and they offered it to me on the spot. So of course I took it.
And by any chance, in this job or any of your future jobs, were you asked about family planning?
No, not that I can ever remember.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Um, and and you started working. Did you have any plans to start a family?
I think it was always in the back of my mind that I would. I mean, I can remember being in high school thinking it would be great to have like 12 kids and a bunch of dogs and drive a station wagon. But it was just sort of like this nebulous thing. Like if I mean, I wasn't working real hard to make it happen. I was really very focused on what I was doing for work because I loved doing it so much. Um, so I can't really remember thinking as I was a younger woman, what I might have to give up or do to have a family. That was not my immediate plans. In fact, I can remember when I first got my apartment in Charleston, West Virginia, I felt like Mary Tyler Moore on the Mary Tyler Moore show. Like I was going to be like this, be real cool single woman and have this career. So
And
yeah.
can you tell us a little bit about the job that you were doing and that you do?
Well, when I was hired as a community relations librarian. And West Virginia at that time, there was a lot of federal money for libraries back then. My job, in addition to like working the main circ desk so many hours a week, was we had a gallery and I had to arrange for the artwork to be rotated in and out of the galleries. We had display windows along the main street, and my job was to like create the displays. And we started with the West Virginia Library Commission because Charleston was the capital of West Virginia. We had a television show. So I got to do like this little weekly television show where we would like interview people and talk about books and reading and what the library was doing and all that kind of stuff. Then I moved on to, I was there for about a year and a half, maybe not quite. Then I became a branch manager at one of the branches, and my branch was back in the hollows of West Virginia. And it was a very different kind of experience from downtown Charleston, which was like the state capital, in that, a lot of people that came into the library weren't able to read. They couldn't, they the school districts were terrible, but they felt that they wanted their kids to read, and become strong readers. So that was really when I started to absorb the whole children's literature thing, because that hadn't really been something that I'd been, doing before. But as a branch manager, I had to. So, I had to, really come up to speed. And I can remember this kind of fun. It was like back before Reading Rainbow. And so they were trying to do some focus groups for Reading Rainbow. And so they brought in LeVar Burton, and a bunch of us West Virginia librarians got to meet LeVar Burton and kind of critique what Reading Rainbow was going to become. And then Reading Rainbow became like this enormous thing. But we were there before it actually started. So that's kind of cool.
Can you tell me a little bit more about Reading Rainbow?
Well, Reading Rainbow was a program that was done by PBS, and it featured LeVar Burton. And, you know, it was one of these things where he would be talking about a particular book, and they would like go and like see where, you know, so it was more just, it was a whole program series that focused on reading and the importance of reading, but it was thematic too. And actually, I didn't really watch a lot of it because I was like grown up, and my kids, I don't know why my kids didn't watch it either. But I mean, it was a big thing. It was like one of the really early public broadcasting shows that featured a Black person. So that was kind of different. I mean, this was like um, he was just coming off of his Roots, when he was like the star of Roots. That was like one of the first mini series that came about. So it was just sort of this real novel approach to introducing reading and books to a whole generation of kids. This was kind of like around the same time as Sesame Street. I don't remember when Sesame Street started, which one which one came first. But it was a really interesting experience. And I got to be on this focus group. So they were asking us, I don't really remember a whole lot about it other than I got to meet LeVar Burton back in the day.
Uh, That's great. That's a great program. Mm, you can you please remind me what year did you had your first son?
My first son,
Yeah.
1985. So
And
I
so
stayed, so when I was in Charleston, West Virginia, and I lived in this apartment building, there was a guy there that I met that also lived in the apartment building, and um, we fell in love and we got married. He was in the Marine Corps at the time. He had actually been in the Marine Corps at the fall of Saigon and went through that, but he was stationed now in Charleston, West Virginia. He got out of the Marine Corps and didn't really have anything else to do. My father at the time had just been appointed the apprenticeship training director for the union. And so there was this little backstory conversation between my husband, Mike, um, who became my husband, and my dad, and decided there wasn't a whole lot of opportunity for him in West Virginia anymore. And he could come to Pittsburgh and we could come to Pittsburgh, and he could be an electrician because my dad could get him this job, and then we would have like, a nice life. I was super unhappy about that, because I had my own TV show and I loved my job, and it was really, really hard. And that was the first time that I had, and wasn't the only time, but it was the first time I had to put my family's needs ahead of mine. So yes, he came up to Pittsburgh and lived with my mom and dad. I've interviewed for jobs, searched for jobs in the Pittsburgh area. I found one and was hired at the Murraysville Community Library. So this would have been, so Mike and I got married in 1979. Um, so that was when we got married. We moved back up to Pittsburgh in 81. And the apprenticeship program was a 4-year program. And I found this job at the Murraysville Library. And again, it was one of those things. I never had a job that I didn't really like. I have lifelong friends that I made from there, but I do remember like the first couple of weeks, I sat there and like sobbed. And the other woman who was working in the library at the time is now my dearest friend. She said, I just kept looking at you day after day coming into work, like crying, thinking, wow. But we got past that. And then my son was born in 1985. I was working at the Murraysville Library at the time. My friend Susan was also pregnant at the same time. And we had gotten a grant to expand the library to double the space. And so for a lot of the time I was pregnant, we were like in this old school bookmobile out behind the library. Um, that was fun during the winter. But, we got through that. So um, and eventually Mike and I bought our own house. We bought the house, and then I didn't want to get pregnant until I paid off all of my school loans from my grad school days. So as soon as we did that, then we decided we could start our family.
So you were telling us that you wanted to pay off your
Right,
debts
so we did
before you
that,
started.
so, yeah.
Uh,
So then my son was born in 85 and my daughter was born in 86. And I continued to work through my pregnancy. With my son, I had, I think, a 3-month maternity leave. I don't believe it was paid. I think I had to use my sick time, whatever sick time I had. I mean, it was not a paid maternity leave. When my daughter was born, we actually, again, I had 3 months off and she was born in August and we moved the end of September. In fact, we signed the closing agreements while I was like in labor. Um, so basically my whole maternity leave was dealt with packing up our house and moving with with a newborn baby and a 14-month-old kid. So yeah,
yeah,
those are
that's
busy
tough.
days. Those
Yeah,
are
busy
busy
days.
days, busy days.
How did you manage your work with your family life?
Um, I can say that being a library director, and for most of my career, I was the library director person. I had a lot of personal autonomy. In other words, I could adjust my schedule for the most part to kind of accommodate family things. I had evening meetings, I had weekend meetings and events and things like that, but I had a lot of control for the most part on scheduling things. So it really was it was hard because you had to be very well organized to get through all of this, but it wasn't like I had a boss who said, no, you can't do that. I worked with a board of directors, and as long as I got done what needed to get done and the schedule was covered and nobody was complaining, I could pretty much do what I needed to do. So it was relatively, I don't want to say easy because they were hard days, but there wasn't a lot of stress put on me from my employer about my family life. They were all very supportive.
And was your husband also supportive of your career?
I would say he was. I continued to work throughout my entire career because after he got through with the apprenticeship program and was an electrician, he was in construction, and the construction industry is very, he actually never got laid off or anything, but there was always that threat. So I continued to work throughout so that we would always have income. Now, I had no health insurance and I had no pension from any of my early employers. Um, after after my daughter was born, I was offered a job at one of the larger libraries, which was about a 20-minute drive away. I took that job thinking it was going to be a step up, and it turned out to be that was the only really bad experience in my whole career. And I only stayed there for 9 months because then the director of the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh, the assistant director, um, sent me this notice and said, I think you should apply for this job. Because I guess it wasn't a secret that I was unhappy. And so I applied for that job and I was hired at the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh, which was like a dream job for me because I used to go there as a child on Saturdays with my sister. And now I was going to be a department head there. So that was really cool.
Well, we're back after a brief intermission for connectivity issues, but we'll continue. So, Denise, can you please tell us a little bit more about when you got your dream job at the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh?
Yes, that really was a dream opportunity for me because having grown up in Pittsburgh and going to that library as a small child, it really was very exciting for me to actually get to work there. I was hired as a department head of the what was called the Popular Library, which was the library on the first floor of the Carnegie, that held the main popular collection as well as the audiovisual and DVDs and all of that kind of stuff. So this was kind of like the late 80s, early 90s, and our department was scheduled to be closed for remodeling. They were going to be doing some remodeling on the entire first floor of the building. And we were going to be the first department in the Carnegie Library to have public access computers. So the card catalogs were located on the second floor. It was a huge, big row after row of catalogs that had all these drawers in. And when we did the remodeling of the first floor, we had 12 public access computer stations and no hard catalogs at all. So that was a real shift in direction. Back then, because of the state of technology, there was a room in the basement that had the huge mainframe with the tapes that went on, and you could go in, and it was all glassed in, so you could go down and watch it. But it was really, it was a wonderful growing experience, not only just to be the department head of one of the main departments at the Carnegie, but also to be involved in bringing online public access computing into the community, getting rid of card catalogs, going through the process of remodeling and having to be closed for various time periods while different parts of the renovations were happening. So that was a really cool kind of thing to be a part of. And so I was there for about 6 years. And near the end of my time there, I got pregnant with my third child. And we were facing a summer with 3 children in childcare. And that was actually going to cost more than what I was making. So we had to make, my husband and I had to make a really hard decision at that time about what to do. And the decision was that I would quit, I would resign, because somebody had to stay home with 3 kids and we couldn't afford to put them in childcare. So that's what we did. And I was able to work, back in those days, they had what they call substitute librarians. So I was able to fill in on weekends and evenings in some of the other departments. So I was able to continue to work part-time at that job, and got kind of through that. But I found I always did find working part-time to be harder than working full-time, because when you're splitting what you do during the period of the day, I never really felt like I was doing either job really well. So after I did resign from the Carnegie Library and continued to work for a couple months as a substitute, we sold our one house and we bought a fixer-upper house. And so that kind of lowered some of our costs, but still, it was a money pit. And I ended up going back to work part-time at Seton Hill College as the evening weekend reference librarian. And I did that for about 2 years. So I would work every Friday night, all day Saturday, and all day Sunday. So my husband and I were kind of splitting childcare that way, but we didn't have family time together because of the way the schedules worked. And then I ended up being offered full-time. And so I moved into a full-time position. And at that time, my 2 older kids were like in elementary school, and my younger son, the one that I had to resign from the Carnegie Library for, actually went to kindergarten at Seton Hill College. They had a full day kindergarten. I could just have him at kindergarten while I was at work, and that worked out really, really well for him. I mean, I did that for probably another 3 or 4 years. And then the Murraysville Community Library, where I had worked for a number of years prior to, excuse me, I'm having sinus issues today. They were looking for a new director, and there was a lot of them. And we had moved into that community. So I lived in Murraysville, where I had worked before. So I knew a lot of people in the community. The kids were in school there. And there was a lot of pressure from different friends within the community and the library board to apply for that job and go for a different one. So I eventually caved in, and that's what I did. So I went back to being the director of the Murraysville Community Library, and that was 2000, I think, the year 2000. And I stayed there for like another 11 years. And that was really one of my favorite jobs. I'm still very close to a lot of the people there, even though I don't live there anymore. It was wonderful to be a part of the community in that way. I could go to the grocery store and people would put their books to be returned back to the library in my car because they knew that I was going there. And that was all fun. I mean, I really loved that idea about being, excuse me, that involved in the community. Along the way, from when I started there, within the county, there were something like 23 different libraries within Westmoreland County. And there was a drive to have a countywide library card and automate, put all of the libraries on the same automation system. And there were some other things going on at that same time with the one library that was kind of in charge of it. And long story short, without going into all of the details, the Murraysville Community Library was given the opportunity to serve as both the system headquarters as well as the district center for Westmoreland County. And as the director of the Murraysville Library, that kind of positioned me right in that role. So I was like, once again, trying to do all of this part-time while working on this fixer-up house and having 3 kids that were in Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, church activities, all of that kind of stuff. So they were just really crazy busy days. Eventually, the board of the Murraysville Library and the board of the system, that was all 23 libraries, said, we need you to pick one way or the other. You can't keep doing both. It's not working for any of us, even though we'd like to keep it to work, but it didn't. So I had another hard decision to make, and I decided to stay with the system because that was so new. And I really wanted to help them get things positioned for success in the future. And that allowed the Murraysville Library to hire somebody to take my place. And while that was a really hard thing for me to do, to see somebody step into my shoes, it really was fine. The system was able to move out of the Murraysville Community Library into its own headquarters. We did a successful migration to bring all 23 libraries into the same automated system and have a countywide card. And things were just kind of perking right along on that regard. So what then kind of happened on the personal front was my husband and I were getting more and more distant from each other. And I was offered a job on the other side of the state. Well, I heard about a job on the other side of the state, and my younger son at this point was now like a junior in high school. And I just thought, well, much as I'd really like to take this job, I can't do that to my kid who's going to be a senior in high school. I just couldn't do that. So I let that opportunity pass. And then it came back up again like 2 years later when he was in college. And I decided to go for that job. It was the first time really since I had actually worked at the Carnegie where I was offered my own health insurance and my own pension plan, because none of the other, well, when I worked at Seton Hill, I have to say I did have that too. So, but I had parts of my career where I didn't have any pension plan or health insurance. And so that was kind of an incentive. So, it was a little bit of a struggle. I'd been married for 33 years. And I knew my husband was not going to follow me across the state. And so it was time. It was time for us to call the end of our marriage. And the kids were all pretty much grown. And actually, it was a little bit rocky for the first year or so. But everybody kind of settled down. My ex-husband now moved back to Minnesota where he was from. Our daughter actually moved there as well. And he's remarried and we're all like compatible and friends. I reconnected with somebody from our church back when I lived in Murraysville and got remarried about 6 years ago. And I stayed, and so the job that I took on the other side of the state was to be the system administrator for the Berks County Public Library system. So it was very similar on paper to the kind of work that I was doing in Westmoreland County. The main difference was that in Berks County, the library system was a department of county government rather than just a nonprofit organization. So I was actually a county department head, and we just administered funding and services to, again, it was about 24 libraries within the county. And that was really kind of a fun job because it was like the first time since I had been out of grad school that I was actually living on my own, had my own schedule, had my own, I could do whatever I wanted to do after work. I could stay at work as long as I wanted. I wasn't answering to anybody. And that was when Larry, my current husband, and I were starting to get back together. He lived in State College, but he had a job where he traveled, sometimes 3 or 4 days a week. He was a telecommunications field service engineer, and his main company was Comcast. So his company sold products to Comcast, and then he would go around and train on these products. So he was on the road like pretty much Monday through Thursday or Tuesday through Friday, and then I would spend weekends in State College, or he would spend weekends in Reading. And he was getting to that age where he was thinking about retiring, and he didn't really want to retire in Reading. So we were just kind of like in this waiting to see what was going to come down the pike kind of thing. And what actually came down the pike was my job here in Center County. So that position opened up and I applied for it and they hired me. And so I got to move from Reading to State College, and here I am. So that was kind of like the overview of my career. I've been here in Center County Library for 7 years now. I really just kind of took it as a job to kind of end my career, just to get me back into State College so we didn't have to retire in Reading. And it turned out to be one of the best jobs I ever had. I had the pleasure of building a nice, strong team. I have a fabulous board that is very supportive and understands, the issues of intellectual freedom and the role of public libraries in the community. They really get that. So I did make the decision over Christmas this past year to retire at the end of 2025. And that again was not an easy decision, but we had to, I'll be 70 and we kind of had to do that. So so I don't know what the future will hold after that, but I have the rest of this year to kind of pull things together. But things kind of worked out really well. And I have to say, looking back over the span of my career, I had, I wasn't in any one position for, I think the longest was my combined Murraysville job, which actually ended up to be pretty close to 18 to 20 years on both ends of it. But, I was never in any one place for longer than maybe 8 or 9 years. Most it was around six to eight. And each job that I had after, each job that I took, it was always bittersweet to leave. I wasn't really looking to end, but I was always intrigued by new possibilities and new opportunities and new positions. And each job that I took, I learned so much more from. So looking back, it was a great career.
Yeah, it's a great overview of your professional career. I have a couple of questions
Sure,
of your life that you
sure.
just told us. In the first place, you mentioned that when you had to like quit your job, your dream job, how did that period that you had to work part-time jobs make you feel? Like, because you told us that you're, and we can see that you're a very career focused person, that you love your job and you truly enjoy and thrive working. So how did that period was for you?
It was personally, they were very busy days because I did have 3 kids. And so you didn't have a whole lot of time to reflect. We were also remodeling or doing this farmhouse that needed everything from a new boiler to new windows to new plumbing to new septic system. And so I was really project managing all of that, because my husband at the time, well, he was an electrical, he worked in electric construction, commercial electric construction. And he, because money was always tight, every opportunity he had for overtime, he took it. So I do think that buying that house that we had thought would be a project to bring us together actually was kind of the death knell in the marriage, because there was just like too much going on. We didn't have a lot of time to nurture our relationship together. We were just kind of like trying to keep everything together. And, we just kind of like, we grew apart. We never were really angry or mad. We just grew apart and had different ideas, different goals. It became really hard. But having to quit the Carnegie, that was to me, that was about as hard as when I had to leave West Virginia. My very first job, it was that same kind of feeling like I have to do this because this is what's important for our family, but not so much what's important for what I wanted to do. So when the job opportunity in Berks County came, part of my thought process was this was my time. This was a job I really want. I don't have to worry. I don't want to worry about my family anymore. They're all pretty much grown and doing their own thing. So I kind of looked at it as this was my time. Um, and I don't know if that helped my ex-husband kind of rationalize the end of our life together or not, but at that point, I just really wanted to have my own time. And maybe that was a little bit selfish. Maybe I should have stayed home and kind of worked things out a little bit more, but it was a really exciting opportunity, and I knew he wasn't going to come with me. And so I did it, and I was really glad that I did it.
Yeah, because you mentioned that you followed your husband twice before
Yeah,
you passed on opportunities because of your family. So I do agree that it was your time,
yeah,
and you deserved to look for more job fulfillment.
yeah.
Um, I also wanted to ask you, you mentioned that you're constantly in jobs where you're the director, so you have people, you manage people, and you also respond to the boards of the different jobs that you had over the years. How was that relationship, one with the board and one with your subordinates?
Um, I'll start with the board because I've worked with different boards in a lot of different capacities. My board in Berks County, when I was a county department head, was an advisory board and not a governing board. So it was really a challenge to kind of keep them engaged because they didn't really have anything to do, except kind of like weigh in with their advice. They weren't really, the only thing they really had to do was develop a fair and equitable funding distribution that would pass along the county money and the state money to our 24 libraries, which was a horrible job because everybody wanted more. And the board would get beat up a lot from comments and things like that about it. And so it was kind of hard to kind of keep them chipper and happy about their role. All of my other boards that I've worked with, I've been doing this kind of work for a really long time, and I've talked to like so many people over the years, and I've never really had problems with my board. I've had maybe some uncomfortable situations with one or two board members. But I ended up, one of my board members when I was at Murraysville and then who moved over to the system was a gentleman who was a retired, when I connected with him and got him on our board, and I actually solicited him to be on the board. Um, he's kind of a prickly person and like a my way or the highway kind of guy. And I ended up having, I mean, he was somebody that had very high standards. And I always felt like I had to do my homework, but it was very challenging. And I can remember lots of times my finance manager and I would sit before the board meeting and go through the finance report to say, all right, what's he gonna pick on this time? And we would like give each other like high fives if he didn't pick on anything, or if we got all the things that he was going to pick on. But I'm still really close to him. Even after I left to go to Berks County, we still stay in touch. He's probably in his early 80s now. and I think that over the course of our years together, there was a feeling of mutual respect. Where he did respect the job that I did and I respected his position. But I also think that a lot of it, he looked at to me as sort of the daughter that he didn't have. I mean, it was that kind of a close relationship. Here in my board in Center County, we do have term limits and limits to terms. So a lot of the board members that were on the board when I was hired are currently not on the board, except one gentleman who had been president, and we actually made him trustee emeritus 2 years ago because he continues to serve as chairperson of the property committee. So, I still am in touch with him on a regular basis. I mean, just this week we were doing the carpet. So I guess in talking about how I feel about working with board members, I find it to be one of the most important things of my job is to make sure that I am supporting the work of the board to do what they're supposed to do and making them feel proud of the work that they do. I respect them. I want them to ask me questions about things because that shows me that they either understand or they don't understand, and it's an opportunity for exchange of learning. But I have found that for the most part, I enjoy working with the boards and I enjoy the turnover and getting them to connect and engage in the work of the library. As far as staffing, I've had lots of different staffs over the years, so you learn a lot as you age through your career. It took me about 4 or 5 years when I got here to Center County to really get a strong team in place. Took a couple missteps. We don't have a big budget. We have to compete with SCLO. We can't afford to pay people that much, and you have to be. What I would look for when I'm hiring is somebody that has a real service mission, and understands that. And then I feel that one of my main roles as the director, once I get my team in place, is to just kind of stay out of their way. Give them the tools that they need, support them, if they have any questions or issues, or they're struggling with something, to kind of just offer some guidance and support. But to just kind of let them learn. I mean, I don't really consider myself to be a micromanager. I don't consider myself to be a nagger. I don't feel comfortable in either one of those roles. But I like to watch my team kind of struggle through some things, and if I can do, here's an example of something that could help. So we're getting ready for the 40th anniversary of our Young Authors and Illustrators contest that obviously we've had for the past 40 years. And we kind of wanted to make it a little bit more special this year because it was a big milestone anniversary. And Megan, who is our youth services person, this is her baby. This is her project, but she's only been here for about 2 years. So she's still a little not too sure. And she wanted to find somebody that could be the keynote speaker that would welcome all the little kids and stuff. And the person that she approached had to back away. And we still had some time, but Megan said, I'm really disappointed that so-and-so isn't going to be able to do this. And I said, do you want me to kind of look through my contacts and see if I can find somebody to step in? And she said, okay. So I was able to do that. And, once I got the main contact, then I could turn it over to Megan and say, here you go, Denise is going to do this for us. And so that's a kind of thing that I like to be able to do for my staff. I like to be able to kind of help them through a little hiccup and then let them manage it the rest of the way. And I think you have to find people, I have to find people when I'm looking for my team that appreciate that. They don't want to have a lot of hands-on management. They want to be able to kind of settle in. So it kind of worked out well. I have had, probably over the course of my career, I've fired maybe 4 or 5 people. Never an easy thing to do. I remember one of my board members talking to me when I like to use my board members to vent. And to have, so if I'm struggling with something, I like to be able to go to the board and say, here's what I'm struggling with. What do you think? And one of my board members, this was back in my Murraysville days, said, sometimes a person's best effort isn't good enough. And that's not your fault. You have to think about what's best for the organization at large. And that's a piece of advice that I hung on to a lot.
Yeah, it's tough, but it's true. And you're in a position that you can actually make decisions so for the organization. So I'm curious about this. You have a very modern, I would think, way of being a boss. I would say. By any chance, do you have any mentor that showed you like this way not to be a micromanager, to assist, but not overbear over your staff?
No, because I actually never, since like the earliest part of my career, I was always the director, the person in charge. So I didn't really, when I was at the Carnegie, yeah, there was the director and the assistant director, and I was a department head. So you did get to kind of see that. But I was always given the opportunity as an employee to kind of manage my own, here's the job, go at it. And yeah, there would be goals. And I remember my one board member that I was talking about, he was really big into SMART goals and strategic planning. And, I've never successfully lived through a strategic plan because something always happens midstream. It throws your plan off kilter. But I do know that you have to have a plan. But I think he was probably a mentor. His name was Chuck. And I think he was kind of a mentor, but it was a mentoring situation where I think I also kind of mentored him a little bit on the differences between corporate mentality and nonprofit mentality. We would have lots of discussions about that. So I can't really say that my mindset was directly involved from an experience that I had as either as an employer, like, oh my God, I don't want to have that kind of a boss. I do remember a coworker that I had when I worked at Seton Hill was not really a very pleasant woman. And she kind of like blew everybody off. And I always made it a point to in the morning to go in and say good morning to her. And when I left, say goodbye to her, and would just like chat on like I didn't know that she was like this difficult person. And I just always felt like she didn't really like me very much. And that's okay, not everybody does. And then I ran into her like years later at some other kind of conference, and she came up and gave me a great big hug. So I was like, wow. So I don't know. I do know growing up, my mom and dad were very focused on working. And my mom was a nagger, and I could see how that just didn't really work. And so I was never a nagger. And, even I had 3 kids, and my kids were all, very different. But they were the 2 older ones in particular were challenging because they were what you would call how do I want to put this? So everything was up for negotiation. They were the kind of kids that always pushed the envelope. When my older son was in high school, he probably spent every Saturday of his senior year, well, maybe not every, in detention. And I was like the town librarian, and I would go out to dinner with school board members and things like that. And here's my kid, like, he went to Bethany, which was where I went, because none of his teachers in high school would write him a letter of recommendation. He now works for the State Department. He's a consulate in Belfast, so I had these kids that were very independent and didn't want a lot of direction either. And so, and I don't know, Andrew, maybe that came from the way I brought them up, or maybe that was just the way they turned out. But, it was the same kind of thing. If I knew they were interested in something, I would just bring home stacks of books. Of course I could, and I would just leave them lay around the house.
Mhm.
The only rule that I really can remember having with them was that I didn't want to read it in the paper. So if they had
Okay.
something that was going to happen, they needed to tell me about it before it hit the paper, because I didn't want to be embarrassed. And that kind of like got us through all three of their senior, their high school years, because what I learned from that is, what do we called it not being a flipper. In other words, they could tell me something and I could just process it without flipping out. My ex-husband couldn't do that. He was a flipper. So we kind of had to manage that. And I think that probably transferred into my work relationships as well, because I do try to maintain a very calm and steady presence. So if somebody's coming in to tell me something that happened, I'm not going to flip out at that. We're going to kind of like listen and then figure out what we have to do to like fix it, but we're not going to flip out. So I think that's kind of like, it must be a personality thing, because I could see it with my kids and I can also see it with some of my employees, my staff.
Yeah, for sure. Now that you mentioned books again, we talked a little bit last week over your love for reading. Over your life, what are your favorite books, if you can name them?
For a lot of years, I read The Road Not Taken by, I think his name is Richard Peck Scott. So that was one of them. I loved Viktor Frankl's, I can't remember the name of it now. He was a gentleman who was at Auschwitz and lost his whole family. And before he went into Auschwitz, he was like a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And so he came out and wrote this, The Meaning of Life. That's what it was. That was a really important book to me. I'm not a big fiction reader. I used to read a lot of mysteries, like cozy mysteries, and I'm kind of doing that again. I'm picking some of that up, but I like to read nonfiction. I like to read a lot of nature writing, travel writing, political writing. I don't really like to be manipulated when I read. So a lot of fiction. Oh, and I don't like, dysfunctional family, because I think that's depressing. I don't want to read about
Mm.
dysfunctional families. I don't, that's, especially if it's fiction. And I also don't like, post-apocalyptic and dystopia kind of fiction. I don't care for that either. Maybe I'm too positive. Maybe I don't want to like go down that rabbit hole. I don't know, but I don't find that enjoyable.
Yeah, totally. Well, I started our interview describing you as a long life librarian and a mother. How would you describe yourself?
Well, I think that that's pretty accurate, because those are the two most significant roles in my life. Um, and now that I'm facing retirement from work, I'm really kind of struggling with how am I going to respond to that, because I have worked almost every day of my life since my like early 20s. Um, so I don't really know. My husband, who is retired now, has been retired for like 5 years, but he worked part-time a little bit. And so he said, you'll find something, it'll be okay. But I'm just kind of waiting to see what that chapter will evolve. And, my children are all grown. Um, the closest one lives 3 hours away. So, it's not that I have that family to like devote time to on a regular basis. It's always kind of special. So I'm just kind of, when I look back, I do think I have good relationships with my adult children and their spouses. My ex-husband and his new wife, we have a pretty good relationship. My current husband, he has 3 children. We're actually going to Denver next week to visit with his son and their family. So, I do have some family, but it's not the kind of a family relationship where we have like dinner every Sunday. It's not that kind of a relationship, but I know if I need them or if I want to go visit them, we can do that. So I think on the whole, that's wonderful.
Yeah, I agree that that's wonderful. And now that you're entering in this new like era of your life, I'm pretty sure seeing your life, I'm pretty sure you're gonna find a way to keep busy, um, and to keep your plate full, maybe with more time for reading and more time for
Well,
activities that you enjoy.
I've been keeping an Excel spreadsheet of things that I want to read, probably since college. My younger son Jack says, "Yeah, I'm gonna die before I finish that." And I know I will, because I add more to it than I ever read through it, but I have it there. So, there's a plan. I'm the kind of person who, when I buy a book, I either buy a book because I just loved it and I didn't want to give it back to the library, so of course I
Hmm.
had to buy it. Or I bought it because I didn't have time to read it then, but I knew I wanted to read it later. So I have like a bookcase full of books like that. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, it's good. I completely understand. I'm a big reader, but I'm also a big book buyer. And sometimes I'm like, I need to stop. I have too much, and I need to read at the level that I'm buying books. So I
Yeah,
completely understand.
yeah.
Looking back on all that you've experienced and achieved throughout your life, what makes you more proud of your younger self?
Hmm. I have to say that I think it's important as a person to really like yourself. And I know a lot of people who don't. They just kind of get through they're so hard on themselves. And they beat themselves up all the time, and they always think I could do better, or I should have done this, or I should have done that. And for whatever reason, I enjoy being me. I don't know, maybe that sounds corny. But I've always felt like if Denise has to take care of herself, because no one else is going to take care of her. And I enjoy my own company. And so I'm very content in that way. So I guess if I'm going to be proud of anything, it's just kind of like the way I evolved to be able to maintain this very positive but pragmatic approach to life.
Yeah, completely agree. As we close our interview, thank you so much for sharing your story with me and our audience. It was truly a pleasure to hear your story about your career, about your life, and I'm very excited to see the impact that your story will have on our project.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be a part of the project. One of my conferences when the American Library Association was in Washington, D.C., I got to go to a behind the scenes tour of the Library of Congress. So you can only imagine how excited I was about all of that. And one of the things that we looked at were their oral history collections that they had. And phenomenal. What a phenomenal thing. And so when I was approached to do this kind of interview, I thought, well, that's kind of cool. So I did enjoy it as well. It was a lot of fun.